invitation. Good morning, everyone. So everybody knows, I guess we are live. I would call together the meeting of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund for Tuesday, March 19th at 10 a.m. In attendance, we have Brooke Moore, Brian Sullivan, Judith Wagner, and Rita Sherry, so the quorum.
And Rita Higgins.
And Rita Higgins is right. So for item number 2, can I have a motion?
Move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Item number 3 would be a update on the fire station property. We'll be hearing that from housing coordinator, consultant,
Specialist.
Specialist.
Tucker Holland, housing specialist. I think most people on the board know that. I'm sorry, the fire station.
Yes.
I thought we were talking about the Nantucket Inn. Sorry. The fire station. Most people probably already know that we had presented to the select board last month the principal of the architecture firm Union Street came from Providence, Rhode Island, to give the presentation to the Board of Selectmen. I think that it's fair to say the presentation was very well received, and Selectman Higgins can perhaps comment further. But the direction coming out of that was they liked the concept of using the site potentially for housing and perhaps other uses. To the extent that somebody actually watches this tape, I want to make sure that we make clear that the rendering was an exercise in determining how many units might fit there, what type of commercial or nonprofit or meeting or town office space might be able to be incorporated into the site as well. So what was prepared for discussion purposes isn't the plan, if you will, that is intended to be submitted and go forward through all the formal processes. It really was a conversation starter.
So I guess my question is, and it's for Rita as much as it is for you, Tucker, the kind of steps moving forward from here on this. So the concept was out there. There was some public opinion that the plan may not have been what some boards on the town are looking for, but how do we move this ball forward?
I believe it's Libby's intention that following town meeting and the election, that a group, maybe a work group, if you will, may be put together to talk about some of the considerations that have come out in discussion following the presentation, and then kind of determine some criteria for how we would move forward.
Great. So we should carry that forward to a May agenda item for conversation.
Yeah, I think Libby's planning to pull a group together again following town meeting and the election.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Anybody else have questions for Tucker? Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 4, the project analysis for the general fund.
Yes. Would you like me to?
Yes, please.
Okay. So at our last meeting, we had a conversation about allocating funds for the analysis of the Nantucket Inn project. And in part of that conversation, we had postponed to this meeting a discussion about whether or not we should have a sort of a pre-approved pool of money in our budget that would give town administration the ability to move forward when projects come in that need to be acted on quickly, to hire consultants rapidly to assess opportunities that come along on small dollar amounts. So it would be sort of under that $10,000 per contract limit, so that which is the threshold by which you have to put out an RFP. So the idea would be to give us the flexibility and give Tucker and town administration the flexibility to move forward, knowing that we would have approved small scale funding for things like the financial analysis of the Nantucket Inn project, which ended up being covered by MHP. They gave us a grant. So the money we authorized at that meeting did not need to be spent because Tucker got funding from MHP on that.
What was
So-
the value of that from MHP?
I don't know the exact number because that was really arranged between Kevin McGuire and MHP. But I can tell you that another firm that we had been connected with would have been substantially more than $10,000.
Great.
Yeah.
So,
So it was good value.
so it was a generous opportunity.
Very much.
Great.
Yep. And I just wanted to reconfirm what Brooke had said about we ended up not needing to spend any of the money that was authorized at the last trust meeting.
Can I just ask?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What was sort of the nature of that grant, or is that something that would be available in the future, or was it pretty specific to the Nantucket Inn?
MHP makes grants of that nature from time to time. So yes, it could be that type of thing. Definitely could be available in the future.
Potentially a fire station conversation for the work group, or maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, they also try to sprinkle it around. So we just
got one. Yeah.
So I'd just like to clarify for anyone watching in the public that MHP stands for Mass Housing Partnership, and they're a nonprofit that supports the creation of affordable housing in the state of Massachusetts. So, and provides financing.
I just wanted to say it was interesting last night. Tucker and Brooke were here with the Nantucket Planning and Economic Development Commission, and Tobias presented, as did Brooke. And I think this is going to be important to have this flexibility of knowing who the go-to evaluators would be on future projects, because if we're fortunate and town meeting and the voters approve the added money for projects, we very likely are going to have to turn around quickly if there's opportunities presented. So I'm glad we held this over from last time, but I hope we're going to be able to target it. I wanted to ask you, Brooke, we talked about kind of types of categories of consulting we might need, and the parameters are under 10,000, right? For whatever they are. What more did you have in mind in terms of criteria?
So I think that the way I view it is that it would be a fund that is discretionary to our housing specialist for things like financial analysis, building property assessment in terms of like
Repair needs or
that kind of thing. So evaluating any property that has structures, having them evaluated.
or
Tucker, what else
environmental.
do you imagine?
Yeah, so like in the case of the Nantucket Inn, for example, if we had been able to move forward on that with the seller, we would have engaged an appraiser, a couple of different types of inspectors, environmental and engineering, an architect to look at the conceptual makeup of the units we would want to create out of combining rooms. We would have spent monies, in addition to the work that Kevin McGuire did, we would have spent money with a highest and best use financial evaluation for the entire property. Kevin was really focused on the housing portion, but I think a big part of FinCom's concern was basically risk mitigation. Like if we did this and the housing thing fell apart, what kind of exposure really or risk are we taking on? And so we had a top-notch firm lined up to assist with that.
So as you envision it, I'm just trying to think if we're moving toward a motion here. Do we need to provide like a list of potential uses with discretion on your part? How would you foresee advising us before you tapped it?
I definitely appreciate the board talking about this today. What I might recommend, which I think is along the lines of where you're going, Judith, is that there's not an immediate urgency to today, but perhaps for the next meeting, I could write up sort of an outline of what it might apply to and limits and so forth, so that we can respond to something more formally.
So just so you know what I had in mind, I had something on the order of us approving to allocate maybe $50,000. renewable, that would probably be enough in any given month, since we're meeting monthly, that we could then discuss it at the next regularly scheduled meeting to renew that commitment. Or maybe we need to think bigger if things are going to move faster. So that's sort of what I had in mind, just so the board's aware of what I was thinking.
And how does procurement fit into this? Is the idea that we have an amount in mind, we have categories of use in mind, and then you would have to get approval from Brian before expending it, or you'd have to come back to us before?
Depends on the dollar amount. So for under 10, we can effectively contract directly. But
On an individual instance.
yeah, but over that amount, you'd have to go through a more formal procurement process.
But I'm just trying to be sure I understand. We put it in the budget so the money's available, but would it be necessary to convene this group before you could enter into a contract, or no? It's saying we decide with this amount of structure built around it, then you have discretion to tap it as needed.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
how I envision it, so
Okay,
that we don't
thank
have
you.
to call emergency meetings.
Okay, that makes sense.
to
And I
be
think
able to move forward.
If the finance people are fine with it too, and we trust you and we know the categories of use, then that seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all would be aware of anything that we would be thinking of spending it on, but to not have to, jump through hoops to convene a quorum on short notice when an opportunity comes up, maybe unexpectedly.
Rima?
I feel more comfortable seeing an outline
Yeah.
from you before we vote on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Tucker, are there examples of how this is done with other boards in the town?
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to, maybe, I don't know if there's like a written policy, for example. I know that Andrew, for example, has that type of situation with the planning board. I don't know the particulars of it, but I wanted to see if, how they might have written it up that might help guide us. So.
Great, let's hold this item over to the next meeting. If you could provide that paperwork for the packet
Yeah.
prior to the meeting so we can review it.
Definitely. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Let's see, we have item number 5, Nantucket Data Platform for presentation.
Hi, everybody. Good to see your faces.
Provide
I'm
your name.
Caroline Frey from the Nantucket Data Platform, and I am here to share with you our deliverable, which is a one-page, two-sided presentation with preliminary findings for our first use case for you to share at the annual town meeting. So as we started to develop this, we had 2 goals, right? The first goal is to ensure that we're explaining what the AHT does, help people understand the goals, the mission, and the approach you're taking. The second goal is to explain the work that NDP is doing to support that mission. There are 2 pieces to that. One, we want to spread awareness, help people get engaged, and we also want to increase participation for our housing survey, which you'll see on the back. We've already triangulated this with Brooke and Rima. They've been very, very helpful, kind of going back and forth on the things they want to see in here. But I want to get feedback from all of you. So I'm going to walk you through it, the whole thing first, and then we can kind of go back to the beginning and do feedback. So the first page is the mission, your approach. We wanted to make sure that people understood what you're doing and how you're doing it. It serves as a bit of a plug, but I know that there are restrictions around the language. You can't advocate certain things. So I want to make sure that you're all really, really comfortable with the language used in here to make sure that you're not running afoul of any of those restrictions in terms of town meeting regulations. So that one's pretty simple and straightforward. I'll give you a second to read through.
It occurs to me that, item 3 does reference the article, that Tobias has proposed, and so we are not committed to that yet. So I'm wondering if perhaps we should set that aside as sort of I'm not sure if we can segregate this into things that we've already planning to do versus things that are potential. That gets more into the potential on the horizon
Yep.
thing rather than something we're already planning to do, because I think we have to be careful that it hasn't been approved yet. So,
Okay, that makes sense. We can do that. And then, are you then allowed to discuss things you might be able to do that's a pending warrant article?
I think you can just looking at this, you can probably just change the word purchase to creation. Because our mission is the creation of housing units, and
Yeah.
not necessarily, like, the purchase may link back, but I think the statement's general enough that it doesn't support.
Yeah, because that is something, I mean, this is something that we have discussed every property that we've looked at. So I don't know if there's a way to, even AHT supports the creation of rentals. I think in the context of town meeting, while this is an idea that we have looked at, using support could be tied to support of an article. So I think if there's a way to reword it in a way that doesn't make that immediate connection.
Encourages.
Yeah.
facilitates, which is the word
Facilitates, yeah. Or it's considered, because you're right, it isn't something that we've done yet, but we have looked at, so.
the AHT plans to facilitate.
I mean, I think that's going in the right direction.
Or the goals of the AHT are to facilitate.
Yeah, one goal of
Yeah.
a goal.
And what we can also do is
We don't have
Brooke
to
and Reem and
wordsmith
I
it
can
here.
work on the language
That'd be great.
offline.
Yeah, if you guys can
we'll-
wordsmith it offline, that'd be great.
Yeah, and we'll bring. I mean, we'll send you obviously another draft once you've
Yeah.
incorporated all the edits.
I think it's
to
close, and
review.
it's something to consider. It's just taking out anything that would directly link it to the article.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else on this front page that you have thoughts on, concerns you want to address?
In the mission, I like the word provide for to be support,
Right.
for the record.
Okay.
I don't know that number 4 is developed enough to include it all. I probably would drop it altogether, the whole paragraph, and just do 1, 2, 3. Well, we're moving in that direction. I think it's too early to represent those statements at town meeting.
Okay.
In hindsight, I would agree.
Everyone agreed? All right.
Although, well, I guess the only thing I would say about leaving it in, but maybe taking out some of the specifics, is that I think that's an opportunity to solicit some feedback. If people know that we are looking for other long-term solutions, you know, and I don't know if it's, you know, pointing to innovation or creativity or outside the box, you know, and even something that says, we'd love your feedback, have an idea, something like that. I think leaving it in would be good without being specific.
Great.
So maybe it's 1, 2, 3 is the approach, and then 4 is a little box saying like these are ideas we're considering, these are things we're looking at. Would like your feedback.
Or just a general statement that we're open to other long-term solutions and that we intend to solicit feedback from the community and other experts in affordable housing.
And I kind of think leaving as it is works. I think our approach is we are really going towards that, looking for other solutions. We haven't figured them out yet. So I like, you know, advocating for other long-term solutions. That could be anything. And I think it fits into our approach. I think it's just taking out the specifics and leaving it a little more open-ended.
So wordsmith that one as well
Yeah.
then. Okay.
And maybe even the first sentence is good, you know, is examining a variety of programs and plans to solicit input from the community and other housing experts.
To develop these further. Yeah.
And I would maybe throw in the phrase Nantucket friendly or Nantucket appropriate.
Okay.
So to the reverse.
All right, side 2. This is probably going to engender some more discussion than side 1. So as we approach this, we wanted to focus on creating a narrative, because without a compelling narrative, it's just numbers on a page. not super helpful. So we start in the upper left-hand corner with the goals of the study, right? What we're trying to do. And then we have the approach and methodology, looking at both the inventory and the housing survey. Below that are preliminary findings. These are rough numbers, they're subject to change, they won't be finalized until July, but we wanted to share what we're finding thus far. And then at the bottom is a nice kind of call to action to get participation in the housing survey, which I think is important.
And the other thing I'd love to see is have this translated into multiple languages if that's feasible in the time frame we have.
Yeah, we can look into that. We'll
survey,
connect
definitely.
offline. The survey will be. The survey will be.
Yeah, but even just the call to action, I don't know.
So just the call to action rather than the whole. If we could, it would be great if we could find people to do the whole thing.
Or if we end up putting this up online, maybe just having an
Have a
online
landing
version that's
page.
translated.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know how you. There's a lot of information here, and it's great. But my initial reaction is, can you cut some of it out, make the fonts bigger, and make the sample points more salient? Right? Is there?
Right.
In the environment of town meeting, while there's a lot to read here, what on this page can we jump off the page, make the fonts a little more legible for the populace?
Right. That was one of our concerns, balancing, trying to show the scope of work that we're doing with something readable, digestible, media bitey. Given that, this, I think, is solid. It doesn't show off the entire scope of work we're doing.
Right.
So we wanted to offer you something additional. We've got the 2-pager, we can run with that. But we'd like to do is give a full progress update that we call a tech sheet. And within that tech sheet, it'll explain the approach, the methodology in more detail, bulk out the findings. It'll include more information on the survey and the methodologies behind that, because that's important. And we can include that as almost like a technical appendix and turn this into a 4-pager. So what we would have is the mission approach on the front, the blurby snapshot on the back, and then like a 2-page technical appendix for more information if people want to dig deeper. And
so,
that would be a gift from us to you.
So taking some of the verbiage here and putting in that technical appendage and make this more graphic
Yeah.
than
We can do
than
that.
verbal.
I love gifts. Thank you. I think the visualization of the data and the graphics on the lead page, followed by maybe the mission after, so and then the second and third behind it, might be a little more visually grabbing to
Sure.
take the deep dive on it. I think that's great. I don't know if this is information we want to also distribute digitally prior to the meeting, just before, and I don't know how we'll execute that. Definitely on our webpage, and then drive links to that through various social media opportunities. But
And the town has a pretty vigorous social media campaign with regard to town meetings, so we may be able to capitalize on that.
great.
I can talk to Libby in her office, or Tucker and I can.
Yeah, we can do that. The one thing we want to ensure that we do is delineate between the AHT policy and advocacy piece and the NDP evidence and facts study piece, because we want to be clear that we're remaining objective and we serve up the data for decision makers and leaders and stakeholders to use, but we ourselves can't craft solutions and guide policy.
Great.
So we'll just make sure that delineation is clear.
Fabulous.
Rima, Judith, you?
Yeah, a larger font is important for town meeting, obviously. And yeah, I like the idea of the 4-page because you can make it a fold over.
Yeah, exactly.
11 by 17.
It'd be like an 11 by 17,
Yeah.
fold it in half. We can
Yes.
have, the graphic snapshot, grab the attention, HT mission and approach, and then the technical piece for people who want to dive into
Yeah.
the details a little bit more.
Get some color happening.
And I think just in that last bit that you said as well, making sure that the back page says, these are the findings. It doesn't have that delineation just in the titles where this says, okay, this is the Affordable Housing Trust, this is our approach. And then on the back, NDP findings, something just a little more clear.
To highlight kind of the NDP, and this is like a study rather than just kind of informative.
It looks like just kind of a carry on from the front until you read it. And maybe
Yeah.
when you do a 4-pager, it'll be organized a bit differently. And I think the information is excellent. I would just agree that some of the formatting and the fonts and things make it a little bit difficult to read.
Right. There's always the trying to cram everything into the one page, but with a 4-pager, I think it's going to lay out nicely.
I would just echo what Brian said. I think having some graphic portrayal, because that's one of your great strengths. And if people are trying to take things in a hurry, that probably speaks to them more potently. Especially if you're having a technical appendix, you don't have to have every point that you're laying out
Exactly.
here with visuals. But I think some of the critical ones, as I am looking at this, is the number being shuffled, the proportion that are available. I mean, you probably 3-4 points instead of 6 or 8 it would probably reach through people's kind of glaze, because it's a very long meeting. It's at night
Right.
after work and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. We can definitely do that.
Yeah, I'm imagining even a pie chart would just, you guys are the
Show
graphics
owner
experts.
occupied or rental. Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll
just-
it's what we do. We'll come up with some good ones for you.
Fabulous.
Can you help me understand, how do you define seasonal resident?
Yes. So seasonal resident is secondary homeowners or seasonal workforce. Basically, anyone who is here for a certain, I have to check with Anna on like the time ranges and stuff and how she exactly delineated it. I can follow up with her in more detail. But anyone who is here like for the summer season, who doesn't live here year round, who isn't just a visitor who's going to be here for a couple weeks.
Can those be extrapolated from one another? Because I think there's in our housing needs assessment, I think there's 2 very different groups, and they have very significantly different income impacts on the community.
Right. Yes, we can. Thinking through in my mind different options, we can do that. What we can definitely, which I think would probably be really helpful, is to pull out employer housing, employee housing, employer-sponsored housing, dormitories and stuff.
Yes, employer-sponsored seasonal housing, yeah.
Yeah.
Because in this seasonal resident, the way you just described that, a seasonal resident might be one house that has one family in it, but a seasonal employee situation would be multiple individuals or families or situation in one.
Yeah. We'll pull that
domicile.
apart for you.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we can do that.
Great.
That also raises, I think, the business about weekly vacation rental. Is that mostly summer also? So it's like you've got 3 pieces there, right? The owner, summer people who own property who are here for the summer, another portion of
Right.
that's being rented to other people, non-employee people, and then the third. I think that really is helpful for people to understand the differences, the impact of the summer and all the dynamics of the summer compared to the rest of what's going on. And I think the business, the focus on the shuffle, I think is really important too, because that's really what's killing people often, or forcing them to leave permanently. So
It becomes a hard number in my mind to kind of nail down, right? Because a summer seasonal house is also a shuffled house, right? Because it gets rented by the week in the summer, and then somebody lives in it for the winter.
Or it may not, depending. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have the summer resident who may rent their house for 3 weeks, but use it for so I'm not sure how you work through your data to kind of nail that down, but I think it's important to classify the differences because each has a very different financial impact on the community.
Yeah, and the important thing to remember too is it's obviously housing unit, not actual residents.
Right.
So we want to be careful not to munge the people that are living there with the purpose of the house or the housing unit.
Good point.
But this chart, we have those descriptions and those definitions, and we'll include that in the technical appendix.
Great.
So the other thing is, when you say weekly vacation rental, does that include if a place is rented for the entire summer to one person? Weekly may not be is that the accurate? Do you actually mean weekly, or do you mean seasonal rental?
Short term.
So
Short term maybe is the better.
we can use short term. It would be a housing unit that is rented by the week.
Yep.
Whether or not someone has rented it for the whole summer and stayed there, we won't necessarily know.
So it would include, okay.
But it would be like a housing unit that's available for a weekly rental.
I think using the word weekly, I would say short term.
Short term?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's nomenclature that's out there now because of the tax,
Tax.
so I think it overlaps well and is consistent.
It just really illustrates what a complicated project this is to try
Right.
Yeah.
And so how this gets out and portrayed is going to really drive the conversation into the future. So we know you're going to do a great job on it. I don't know, but the more I think about, the harder it gets. So
Yeah.
I don't know if this one is. This would be a good one for graphic portrayal, I think. But that all depends on if you can make clear what the categories are.
Yeah, we have the definitions. Anna and the team have a pretty rigorous process for pushing these houses through the pipeline and delineating which ones are used for what. And we can get you all of that information and make it super clear. Obviously, space precludes it here, but it will be in the appendix.
Great.
Any more comments for Lisa from the board? Tucker, do you have a comment on this project?
Yeah, I just had a couple questions. So I wanted to underscore the comments about graphic illustration and so forth, and some of the titles that we just were talking about. I guess this is more formatting, but again, on the font size thing, if we could increase the mission to be more comparably font size to the rest of the page. I think there's enough space to work with on that. But the bigger thing was, I'm sure that you all have looked at the workforce housing needs assessment, and I haven't had an opportunity to do a comparison about the number of year-round units and so forth, but my recollection is the numbers in there don't necessarily differ tremendously on a percentage basis, but I believe, for example, the number of total housing units was substantially different according to the last census. And my point is simply that some people may have that data set like in mind. And so I think it's important to maybe address a little bit like why these numbers might vary from, without getting too wordy. I agree with Brian's comment about trying to, less is more. But I think I don't want people to challenge, why are these numbers this way, sort of.
I think where your mind is going, people are going to look to that figure and then extrapolate to 10%. What's the shy list? Is that kind of where you're...
That could be a possibility, but it just was more that, I think some people are familiar with the figures that are in that, or maybe getting familiar with the figures that are in there coming into town meeting. And if, for example, 11,000 is sort of the number I had in my recollected from that study about the number of residences of all types here. 4,900 and change of which were year round at that point.
Yep.
So, like if it's
worth representing that as the historic number from the 2010.
And maybe why these numbers might reflect differently. Like I certainly would expect, or I wouldn't be surprised if the gross number of year-round units declined, for example, since that study was done, is for reasons we've talked about before. But the number of overall units on the island, to me, would only have increased since the last census. So that's just a disconnect. And yeah. Yes.
Yeah, good point. Toby actually brought that up earlier, specifically that 11,000 number. I want to give you accurate answers, so I'm going to double check with our team, the data scientists, and understand the methodology exactly that they went through. But those sources may have been very, very different. They may be including commercial, other buildings that, aren't tagged as a residential. The other thing that we did, we went through a pretty exhaustive process of matching the addresses and understanding which addresses meant which parcels. So we have parcel IDs. We call them like a lat long for each of these properties. And what we've seen is there are a lot of duplicates out there, even on the assessor's roll. So what we did was go through and look at, okay, this parcel has 2 different addresses from 2 different sources, but it's the same house, it's the same parcel. Or, there are typos, misspellings. And so that will often lead to an overabundance of listings. Often a legal residence has a different address than a rental residence that they'll put on there. So some of the diff might be that process of cutting it down. But I will follow up with our data scientists to understand. I know that they've used that study and I've looked at it. So I'll follow up and make sure they understand. And then however we can kind of highlight that, and say, this is specifically, these categories, it may differ because of this and this. We'll figure out a good way to do that.
And I think, to speak to Tucker's concern, that people can dismiss, as it were, throw the baby out with the bathwater if they have doubt about something. So being able to explain it so that we have an answer to why it's different.
I'm not saying what the right answer is,
Yeah.
but to be able to explain that people may have in mind, a different number from a prior study, but for the reasons you just cited, this is why we believe in this number, kind of thing.
Yeah. And that'll come through in the text sheet too, when you see the specific definitions and the methodology for each category, because we're putting every single property through those tests to understand exactly the use and how they should be designated. So we'll talk about that in more detail to make it clear.
So potentially your process is more thorough than what's been done in the past.
Potentially. I would like to say yes.
Any more board comments? Rima?
Just on that number, if a property has a secondary dwelling, are you counting it as
A separate housing unit.
it is?
Yeah.
So the 9,100 includes secondary dwellings or just includes parcels?
That includes secondary dwellings.
Okay, good.
Any other comments?
Thank you.
Hearing none. Thank you very much. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Item number 6, discussion presentation warrant articles related to Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Yes, Tucker.
Yes.
With the shortage of rental unit, it says the shortage of rental units results in rental sites that exceed what many year-round workers can do. So it's looking at the income levels and what people can afford. And is demand at the different levels part of what's going to be produced?
Yeah. So the 2 different pieces of this project are the housing inventory and the housing survey. The housing inventory is primarily focused on supply, and that's the information that we have available now because we haven't run the survey yet. So in the survey, we'll assess both actual demand as well as the nature of that demand, what kind of preferences people have, what kind of needs, they want to rent, do they want to own. So it'll look at the rental. So we'll actually get rental rates from that survey because there are no reliable rental estimates. The census ones are way off, so we have to create our own. So the survey is part of the way that we're doing that.
But will it, from the work, would the group be able to determine that, like, there's, much larger demand, for example,
Yes.
between 150 and 175 than there might be between 100 and 120?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it worth putting the rental rates for the different percentages that exist out there? Should we list what an 80% a two-bedroom unit or 100% two-bedroom unit of AMI is as an educational opportunity to go out to the community?
So for instance, what Housing Nantucket rents
Yeah.
an 80 or 100 at?
If we're doing a distribution, I guess the question is this an opportunity to say what are the targets we're ultimately going for?
Yeah, I think if there's space, because that is something that people always ask about. What are these different AMIs? What does that mean?
What does that mean,
Yeah.
right? What's 80% mean in a rent versus a buy versus, and I don't think you do them, I don't know. It's a distribution opportunity for information. I don't know.
And I can get you those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really simple to pull in. And if that's important to you, we'll make sure we have space for it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think using your visualization skills, I really struggle when I try to communicate this publicly about family size, income cap at different levels, and then what the rent would be, or
Right.
the housing cost should be according to DHCD at those various. I mean, it's sort of a three-dimensional visualization, so I really struggle with it. So having help with that, and I know it's not necessarily in the scope of your work, but it would be extremely helpful.
We'll see what we can do.
Okay.
More gifts.
Okay, now really hearing none, we're going to move on to the next item. Item number 6. Discussion and presentation warrant articles related to Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Tucker, do you want to lead this conversation, or we want to jump right to Toby on the first? Do you want to cover the other
Do you want
items
to talk
quickly?
about the other ones?
Yeah, let's cover the other quickly, and then we can have a more involved conversation.
Yeah. So the board is where there basically are 3 articles that are up for consideration and potential discussion at town meeting related to funding for the trust fund. Everyone's aware the Nantucket Inn is not going to be discussed, but the 3 are the CPC as part of their annual award to the trust. They voted to support $750 in funding for the trust fund this coming year. In addition, there's a separate article that supports $5 million of bonding. You all recall the select board had voted unanimously, I believe, to support a $3 million funding, had tasked the finance department, Brian Turbot, with, where could this come from? And through, a series of discussions and work with the CPC, they have voted favorably to support a $5 million bonding. And in effect, what that equates to, as you all know, the CPC annually has to award at least 10% of their monies to housing, to open space, and to preservation. So the rest of their monies, the 70%, is discretionary within those 3 categories. So in what they have done with the bonding, they basically have said, we're willing to commit 20% of our annual revenue to this purpose. That still leaves them an incredible amount of discretionary funding to work with annually. And last night at the NP and EDC meeting, that article was unanimously supported. It's been supported by the select board, the finance committee, and of course the CPC itself. Then the final article, I will turn over to Mr. Glidden.
Great. Just before you do that, does the board have any comments on either of the 2 previous ones? Great. Tobias? Thank you, Tucker.
Okay, yeah, I did. I left
I
it in the
don't need
car
one
though.
either.
Thank you.
It's a very good handout. You really did a great job on it.
Well, since we presented last night, we're working away updating it. So always trying to get better. So thank you again, Affordable Housing Trust Fund, Tobias Glidden, 24 Rugged Road. So after meeting, maybe to backtrack, I guess this is the first time I'm kind of presenting to you guys kind of this neighborhood first program officially, but there's been many times that this has been talked about. The idea of purchasing pre-existing units and putting them on the SHI list. So over the last 3 months, Rick Atherton, myself, Tucker, and Kutzba, Brooke, and numerous other people in the community, kind of Brian Sullivan as well, kind of worked diligently to see like what it would look like if in 2018 you purchased housing units. We looked at 11 parcels here to get you 25 units onto the SHI list. So you'd be looking at taking a parcel, and one of the units on that parcel would go onto the SHI list at 80%, and then the other potentially 1 or 2 units would be rented out at either 120 or market rate. So kind of, I can go through this like in detail. This is a pretty financially intensive document to a certain extent. So I can go through that briefly, but to kind of let everybody know where we're at. So 2 weeks ago, we met numerous times with the finance committee, and they ended up supporting this article up to $10 million with 2 added pieces of information that deed restrictions or interest in properties would be included, and that all properties purchased have to be within 30 to 200% AMI, and that's for them to be bonded properly. Then the Board of Selectmen met, and they voted on allocating $20 million to this program, or recommending that for town meeting. So that's kind of where we stand now, and I'm very supportive of the 20 million. I think that makes a lot of sense. So to walk you through this, if you want to kind of look at the vertical orientation of the page, we have 11 sites, 53 bedrooms. So we're getting a lot of bedrooms. Again, this is a retrospective of looking at 2018. So we get about, the use of capital. So we look at improvements, we look at the acquisition. It's about $15.8 million to purchase all in 1 year. We go through and, we lay out kind of the capital expenditures to what it would cost to kind of create a tertiary dwelling in some of these locations. They all, a lot of new roofs. So we added in a lot for capital expenses. Going through kind of your annual operating costs, we went through really diligently, line item by line item in the last week. So Rita, this is even more updated than the version you got to see most recently, but I'm kind of walking through everything from, we're accounting for what the real estate tax would be, that lost income. We're accounting for, administrative fees, repairs, marketing, landscaping. Rita, I doubled it from last time we talked. And so we're kind of at, for the annual operating expenses, $461,000 for 25 units of housing. At the bottom, you can see kind of those rents laid out. And then if we turn over, we can kind of look through, does this really make sense financially? And so looking at that, we're looking at, gross income. So we're doing about $680,000 of income per year in this program projected. Operating expenses of $460,000. So, moving into our net operating income, third column down, we're seeing that year 2, we're generating about $200,000 a year in income, because the first year we're assuming, just being very conservative again, that we're not collecting any rent. Next, further down, the debt service. So about 1.1 million per year. Covers this program amortized out over 20 years. And then at the bottom again, you can see all the real units I looked at to build the financials for this program on. So any questions you have or thoughts? There's a lot of a lot of details, specifics as far as like how this program would be operated, how it would be managed. I can talk more about that, but it might be a good time to take questions. Lastly, this is a process that I really look at it as like we're all trying to find the solution to housing together. This is another piece in the toolbox. So any criticism or thoughts, feedback, we're all trying to make things better. So I really appreciate it.
So we'll open that up to the board. Rita?
I just have a quick question about rents and utilities at the bottom of the vertical page. The rents, are those exclusive of utilities?
Like, do they not?
They don't include do those include electricity? So like when someone looks at their rent, is this rent and then they're going to pay utilities in addition?
So for the 80, the short answer is it is exclusive of utilities.
Okay.
Yeah.
So some of these, just wondering then, so sort of the operating income, that's probably just the rents. You have some utilities included in the annual operating expenses. So I'm just...
Those are the common utilities. So in the unlikely situation, you had a building like with some that had 3 units associated with it, with some common space that wasn't connected with any particular apartment. So it's a modest allowance for that type of situation.
Okay. And so then some things like Comcast would be in the renters' names and then they would pay that. So that's excluded here. Okay. The other question that I've been asked is how much oversight the select board has on the Affordable Housing Trust and whether or not someone asked if the 100,000 stands, and I don't know. So I'm just wondering the way that you've thought it out or the way that it's come up in further discussion, what sort of oversight select board does have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of the, and Mr. Glenn can speak more to this, but part of I think the selling point of this program is, so there are only a couple of entities actually that could execute the program using the town funding and bonding and so forth. So one would be the trust, one would be the housing authority. I think that for a whole variety of reasons, the trust really lends itself the best to financially administering this program. So from there, I think it's everyone's firm belief that, this would operate in the same manner that the trust does with any of its other funds, that any expenditures over 100,000 would be required to go to the select board. And again, Mr. Glenn can talk, a little more detail about this, but we've, thought about the, how, not just the financials, but, how would this get implemented, should it pass at town meeting and at the ballot?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit more about that specifically. So there's, in my mind, there's kind of 3 maybe processes that need to be sorted out. One is the actual selecting of what properties we want to choose is that's kind of the first piece. I kind of went through, looked about at 100 different properties and said, these would make sense to purchase. My rationale was, the properties aren't right next to each other. They're in different neighborhoods. They're on separate lots. They have multiple units on them or the potential to build another unit on them. And they're in pretty good condition. That's just me thinking in my head, but that needs to be enumerated. And I think that's something that, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and maybe with some outside help could put together. If you had a work group focused on the neighborhood housing first program, you could enumerate those a little more clearly. That's kind of the first piece of which housing properties you're selecting, Brian.
If I may, I think we went through that discussion, was it 2 meetings ago? And there were some notes compiled, so if we can provide those. Am I correct that we
talked about it not in relation to Tobias's
The
article?
RFP discussion.
Yeah, in our RFP discussion, we kind of started that outline, so
Yeah.
if we can deliver that.
Yeah, so that's just that's kind of the first piece. I think that's important. Then the second piece is kind of a checklist for purchasing properties. So, you know, in a program like this, you know, we have, you know, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund would be the, you know, the entity selecting the properties to purchase, but ultimately the Board of Selectmen has to approve the funding, and then there's, you know, Brian Turbot from the Finance Department has to sign off on it. So there's kind of like a checklist of pieces that need to be in place that we all need to understand. That would be good in general for everybody to have a good understanding of what happens, what needs to take place to actually purchase a property. So that's kind of piece number 2.
So, so that's sort of the process of procurement and the selection and the actual negotiations and contract and so on. That's what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
It's the actual, what are the steps? And one of the points that I made to Tobias is that we're going to need to formulate that so people who respond to a request for interest know exactly what they're getting into up front, so they know what our process and our timeline is, and lay out those expectations. So
Yeah, it's almost like when you're applying to like a grant, like you know what the process is. Like it should be very clear. Everybody on this committee and in the community should know, like, I want to sell my house to the town, to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There's the process. It's laid out, it's public, it's very transparent. I want like a lot of transparency in this process as well. I think that's very important. So that's kind of the second piece. The third piece is kind of the management of the properties and what that would entail and look like. And so under these financials, we've, you know, tried to look at what it would cost for, you know, either the town or an entity like Housing Nantucket or an entity like Halkeen, or another entity that's capable of managing properties. Going through these numbers, you know, they're based on, you know, real costs of managing properties. So we talked in detail with Anne in that regard. So the Affordable Housing Trust Fund would need to draft a, you know, essentially like an RFP to, you know, send out to say, we have 2 or 3 properties to manage that we've purchased, and we'd like for you to oversee them. Some of the nuances there are, you know, ideally a program like this would be, you're not going to be purchasing all 11 properties all at once. That's never going to happen. You'd maybe be purchasing 2, 3, 4 in any given year. So that being said, you might want to, you know, time your RFP to have a cluster of houses or do it one at a time. There's some kind of efficiencies in you know, going to the Board of Selectmen. You might want to select. So kind of understanding that process from that step 1, 2, and 3, you want to understand, okay, we're looking at purchasing these 2. You might go ask for authorization for 2 at a time and then issue an RFP for managing those 2, just to streamline things. But a couple of the details that need to be flushed out are, you know, if the town were to want to use 1 or 2 of those units for rental purposes, that would have to be part of the agreement built into that RFP. So that's a detail that needs to be ironed out a little bit more. You know, kind of what those terms are for that RFP. Is it a 99-year lease? Is it, I don't know, there's a lot of different nuances in that, but that's kind of like the last piece that we need to sort through as a community, and you as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund need to have a full understanding of kind of what you're looking for in managing these properties and making sure they're managed in a, you know, in a proper way, so on and so forth.
Any board member questions? Go ahead, Brett.
So I'd just like to comment and talk a little bit about, I've been meeting with Tucker and Tobias quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, and I had the opportunity to think this through perhaps more than the rest of you folks. And I think it's important that if we're going to be tasked with this, implementing this program, should it pass town meeting and the ballot, that we recognize that we will need to bring in outside expertise, and that I almost envision a subcommittee or a implementation committee of sorts being formed with members of this board and other experts, and also potentially the use of consultants, help from MHP, because they have a lot of experience with this. So that's how I sort of envision us going about the implementation of this. So there's sort of a process of setting up the program and structuring it and enumerating all the details and making sure there's a plan in place for the implementation before we start buying properties. And then once we get to that phase of understanding how the program's going to function and we move into the acquisition phase, that then we have either a subset of this group with some outside help being a permanent review committee for evaluating and scoring properties and bringing them back to us for approval for purchase. And that there be objective criteria, some of them numerical and some of them qualitative, and then they would be scored by that group and be recommended or not recommended back to this group. So that's how I sort of envision this going forward, and I hope that makes sense to everybody, and open to comment or other suggestions.
Judith?
I think that makes a lot of sense and will give the community a sense of the expertise here and care. The one thing I still worry about is the speed of those functions, because if property's on the market, if there's other contending purchasers. Last night, one of you said we're losing 30% of year-round housing per year. If you look at what the purchase patterns are, either going to seasonal people who just come in the summer or to investors who are going to rent. So I don't know. We've talked about that, trying to get more closely connected to land bank, others like the realtor community, banking community, whatever. I wonder if there's going to be another financial downturn. We may be keeping an eye on potential foreclosure property. I mean, it seems to me that we're going to need systems as well as personnel. And I'm thinking maybe, Brian, you have something to add on that. I mean, you've just been through this in other ways, but I just wonder, do we have good answers about the reality check of can this really happen at the end of the day? I'm supportive of it, but that just keeps coming back as an uneasy point to me.
So, if I may, Judith,
Yeah.
the acquisition process and competing in the free market gives me a tremendous amount of anxiety. As far as being able to accomplish the transaction competing in the free market, I see we really need to define the process well, so it's understood by everybody. My bits and pieces that I understand about procurement, that I understand about kind of the real estate process, the Board of Selectmen approval aspect, the scoring, in the price point that we're looking at, the examples is incredibly competitive in the free market today. So we will need to develop a system. I think that it's important that we have an agenda item for the April meeting, as we know what to set up a committee to work on that, to get it out there, because I see through an RFI and an RFP is really the only way that we're going to be able to compete, if people are willing to bring us properties prior to going to the free market. And when we get to the free market situation, it will become a disappointing process as we go through, if that's our only option.
Well, and some of that, given our recent experience, I don't know, I can imagine some kind of a system, maybe others have done this, you folks may know, but some kind of option to purchase or, put a hold on some kind of contract right that you can say, we'll give you $10,000 something if you give us 6 weeks to sort of like we tried to do with the Nantucket Inn. But I just think that's going to be something we need to kind of have, not only strategy, but also some tools to figure out how to make that happen. And that's also going to your point about expertise, Brooke, because we need to be more connected to the bank community, others advising elders about maybe downsizing houses or whatever else may be going on there, if we're going to be able to identify people who may, for the love of the island and its people, rather than jumping straight into the free market say that this is really, and maybe there's some way we should recognize them. I don't know what that would be, but I think we're going to have to work around some of those things to really make it happen.
Thank you, Judith Tucker.
Yeah, completely agree. And I agree with what Brian was saying. You know, this is probably not going to be a program where we're out there competing with the individual buyer on the property that came up for sale last week type of thing. I mean, it's going to have to be through a more formalized procurement process with it stated right up front there. You know, this is the slow boat, not the high line. But to your point, Judith, I think there may be folks who respond to an RFI and say, you know, I need to be cognizant of my finances and what I'm doing here, but at the same time, I would equally love to see this go to a year-rounder versus, you know, sold to as an investment property type of thing. So there are a lot of details to work about. I have complete confidence that this committee can sort it out, and I think the type of thing that Brooke was talking about, I think the idea there was similar to the Six Fairgrounds process. We had, you know, a review committee with the finance committee chairman, an expert in affordable housing, select board members, real estate folks, et cetera, you know, represented. I think I'd add legal in this case, as well as maybe elder concerns to this group that can be advising both on criteria for how we might look at selecting properties, evaluating properties that come in, so they're coming to this group with the recommendation, because there's going to be a ton of work associated with this program, and I don't think it can all sit, you know, on your shoulders.
Thank you. Brooke?
So, oh my gosh, I think I almost lost my train of thought there. It'll come back to me in a minute.
Rima, will you be sharing your notes with Megan?
I can.
Could you just note to carry this over for an agenda item for the April meeting for a work group creation?
She'll probably watch this.
That's true. Any more questions or comments?
Yeah, just to summarize, and just a few things I want to include, so we all like really understand this, is that this is an expensive program. You know, it's not the cheapest way of doing things, but I think looking out as our community as a whole, we've seen, you know, kind of the response to Richmond, the response to, you know, 6FG, and the fact, you know, the response to Surfside Crossing, and that we want, you know, the community is kind of said, we want some more scattered site. So this is a response to saying, hey, you want more scattered site? This is an option. You know, I don't want to try to sell anybody a bill of goods that this is like the cheapest, greatest way to solve it all. This is another tool in the toolkit of solving the housing crisis. Secondly, I just wanted to add in, because I know you're going to be talking about it later on the agenda, you know, kind of the other big thing people come to me and they ask about is, you know, how much is it gonna, you know, oh, it's a lot of, you know, $20 million is a lot of money. How's it going to affect my taxes, X, Y, and Z? And, you know, I kind of look out and say, you know, with the new income of the short-term rental tax, you know, we're talking about a couple $1 million. In theory, this program is just an authorization, and you're not necessarily going to impact anybody's tax rolls. I know some of the projections were anywhere between, you know, $1 and $3 million of new revenue from the short-term rental tax. So, you know, there are funds coming down the pipeline to fund a program like this. This is the, you know, asking for $20 million up front, I think is important because it gives us the flexibility to kind of implement the program at the scale that's necessary. Yeah.
Great. Yes, Brooke.
So, two things. First of all, I wanted to remind everybody that the town can't pay more than appraised value anyway. So if someone swoops in and offers a cash deal over appraised value, we're out of the game anyway. So it's important to remember that. We're not going to outbid someone. And, there will be times in the market where that's going to be a challenge for sure. But the other thing about the long-term finances of this that I found compelling after I did this deep dive into it is we're talking about, yes, a $20 million investment, a 20-year bond, that once it's paid off, this is actually a revenue-generating program on the order of several $100,000 a year that could be reinvested in additional year-round committed deeded housing at different levels of affordability. So when I think about it, I'm thinking about the long game in terms of the year-round housing challenges that this island is going to face forever, given our economy and the way it functions. And so I was skeptical, to be honest with you, about this, thinking about the expense of it. But we also then have a long-term investment as a community in the real estate. So it's not like we're throwing money at something and giving it to someone. The town would own property that has value. So we're acquiring an asset and we're investing in our community, and we're investing not only in real estate, but in our year-round people. So from that perspective, I found it convincing as something that I could really get behind 100%. I did not start there.
So I will say it was a very bold ask, and I compliment you for bringing it to the table and kind of working through the particulars. Before we kind of get a consensus of the board, Tucker, did you have another comment?
I just could not comment about, Tobias is talking about reactions to different things. There has clearly been a reaction to Surfside Crossing, like with, maybe well-merited reaction. Six Fairgrounds is a town voted, approved at multiple town meetings unanimously to move forward. The fact that there are 3 neighbors who aren't happy is hardly a reaction to Six Fairgrounds, just to clarify.
Great. So I don't know that there's a votable item, but is there any motion that anybody wants to provide, or?
I don't know who gets to have comments, but last night the NPDC said this is related to planning and that we support things. So if it's in order, I'd make a motion that says we think we support this. I don't know whether that gets reported anywhere or...
I think it's probably safer not to vote, to be blunt about it, this body, because you're going to be the administrators. And I know that, for instance, you cannot have like a handout at town meeting that says vote for this. So.
Okay.
Fair enough.
But I appreciate the sentiment.
Fair enough, and I echo your sentiment that that I commend the citizen for bringing the article to the table, so, and all the work put into it. So thank you. Any more commentary?
I just want to say 2 things to all of you, Ann and Tucker and Brooke, and I don't know who else has been involved with you, Tobias, and with Rick, but this couldn't have happened without a whole lot of work, and we see that and appreciate it.
And I suppose I would just go back to my very first comment and say that I don't think people do understand that there is select board oversight, and the general sense that I've gotten is that people would be more supportive knowing that that is true. So good point to make.
We'll make a note of including that.
Great. Hearing no more comments, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, update on the Mass Housing Choice Program. Brooke, can you take this up to use the restroom?
Sure. Tucker?
It's a brief update. The applications for this year's grant rounds will open up in April, and we'll learn what the criteria is then.
Tucker, can you tell us what the potential uses of those funds are?
So probably a prime candidate would be the construction of Waite Drive. That would be probably a high scoring project for receipt of those monies. So it would obviously offset monies that the town had already planned for that project.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, hearing nothing, we'll move on to item number 8, strategic plan final draft. I'm happy to report that we are scheduled to present the strategic plan to the select board next week at their regular scheduled meeting, and that Judy Barrett is planning to fly over and make a presentation on our behalf of the details of the process and the implementation strategies. Rita, do you have anything?
No, I think the board is looking forward to it. It was a request from other board members, and I think it is in keeping with the ask that on the warrant, as well as sort of what we had promised to our board. The one thing I do think Judy should be prepared for, and we should be prepared for, is that at least one board member might ask about why we didn't tackle zoning in this. So
Let us guess who that is.
We'll keep it a mystery. Yeah, no, I was going to ask, Rita, there are other, I mean, that certainly can be included in there. I mean, Nantucket actually, 95% of communities in Massachusetts or anywhere would love to have the types of provisions we have in our zoning code that try to promote housing, but we're just, in a whole different league in terms of cost. Not that there couldn't be additional things. But my question was just, are there other things that you think might be of particular interest in the board that Judy should emphasize in the presentation?
I think the big thing is that, we made a really good case for the $5 million based on the sort of clarity of vision that we had through our strategic planning process. Mm-hmm. And I think just communicating that, we do have this plan, and that and you might know more about this at this stage, but that we've already started implementing the plan.
And she does plan to begin talking about that as well, the implementation portion of things and the directions that the actions we're already taking, mm-hmm. That were built into the goals mm-hmm. of the strategic plan. And I think the other thing that I'd like to do, and I'm not sure where that should come from, is we did have a comment from a finance committee member that we had not brought them a report of our activities for the year that we've done in the past. And I'm going to ask that we invite the members of the finance committee to the select board meeting personally next week, and whether they need to call, notice a meeting if a quorum is going to come, and just invite them to participate as well.
I think that, and this is, sorry, Judith, that activity report is so key to us, and I know we talked about it in our strategic plan, but I just think, with nonprofits, when they send out their solicitations for donations, it says these are all the things that we have to do. They really make the case, and I think we are still lacking that a bit mm-hmm. in a way that is engaging and people can see it right away. Yeah, sorry, I lost my other thought. Go ahead, Judith.
Two things. One is one answer on that zoning question. I don't know if Judy would think to make this response to begin with, but people were seriously engaged, as you very well know, with possible legislative reform in the last year. And so if the statutes in Massachusetts are pretty behind the times in terms of tools available for certain kinds of land use, and the governor's priority has been mm-hmm. housing production. So at some level, it seems like it needs efforts around zoning changes or land use regulation has to take that into account in terms of the timing. A related point is, I think that within the planning board, I know you'll remember that at least one of the members of this group was strongly of the view that this group shouldn't get into that it should really be the planning board or possibly the NPDC. And we did talk about a number of ideas that might have been proposed by citizens, for example, or being proposed by board members for possible action mm-hmm. annual town meeting. And I think, so it's not that nobody's been thinking about that, it's just it takes time to perfect some of that. There really aren't easy fixes. The last thing I wanted to say is, frankly, my views, I'm disappointed in the strategic plan. Just, we put a lot of work into it. I find the monthly discussions we've had with bulleted items and things on a list about what we're pursuing to be more persuasive in terms of what the vision is and what the forward motion is. And I don't know if that's suitable to be included in handout materials to the select board at the meeting coming up or to the FinCom. But I think the way the strategic plan, for all the good efforts everybody made, was, a lot of it was process guided by a framework that, you know, you can love it or not love it, but I found it was kind of forced. And whenever we tried to get specific into things we might want to do, we were back into the broader conversation about who are possible allies or prioritization in the abstract or one thing or another. But I think there's been a lot more very good work, in-depth, concrete work done here. So if it's at all appropriate, I would just wonder if that kind of spreadsheet summary that we've been proceeding with could not also be presented, because when I look at the printed version that Judy came up with, it's sort of like, to me, that's sort of her report as opposed to our report. If that makes any sense, that's how it feels to me as a relative newcomer here, that it took a long process. It was using a format, but I think the proof in the pudding really is more of the work plan down on the ground. And I think that would be reassuring to others, including FinCom, to know that that's something we work on every meeting with checkoffs and timing and all that kind of thing. So if that's appropriate, I just wanted to suggest that might be good to bring that into the conversation.
NDP isn't the only one giving presents today. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great additional material for the board to have and to look at, is the concrete actions that we've taken. The only thing I would say about your comments on our strategic plan and the process is that I think that this board, and this might have been the year leading up to when you were on it, Judith, we didn't have structure, we didn't have process, and we couldn't communicate. And I think that for the amount of time that Judy had to spend with us on our strategic plan, that's what the plan got us to do. And I think we all were very solution-oriented. And every time we talked, we wanted to say, what about a down payment assistance program? What about this? What about that? And we weren't able to even really crack those because we didn't have that foundation level strategic vision. And so I think that while I agree that some of the details and the real sort of nitty-gritty action steps and programs, details that we wanted, I think now with the tools and the skill set we developed through that process, we're actually able to put into the plan. So I think that if we were to do a sort of second go at it, that it would be very different from it was a year ago. But a year ago, I do think that what Judy brought to us is what we needed. We didn't have that foundation. So I also think the other point to the, why don't we tackle zoning and why isn't there more detail, is that the strategic plans are meant to be 3 to 5 year plans. And so we focused on creating that foundation for going forward. And the next iteration might tackle zoning, might tackle specific programs. And that's something that's been very helpful for the select board. We get all the time, why didn't we tackle mental illness? Why didn't we tackle, focusing on elderly services? And it's, for better or worse, in our strategic plan process, 3 things came to the surface. And so that's what we're focusing on in this 3-year time. So.
Go ahead, Brooke.
I would also agree strongly that for me, the process was incredibly valuable as a relatively new member to a public policy board. Having that conversation about how we do business and how we decide what to do really helped me focus and prioritize the direction that we needed to take. And so I think out of that came the work that got put into creating that spreadsheet. So I think it's the next iteration, and I think there's great value in they're seeing we were already doing the work before we finished the strategic planning process, which I think says a lot about how valuable that process was, because it gave me language and helped me understand process of how a board like this should function and how it could function and accomplish great things. So I agree with you. People are going to be looking for what's the plan, what's the plan? How many times do we hear that, right? What's the plan? But I think understanding the process to make the plan is equally as important as the plan itself.
Well, I think too,
Go ahead, Jess.
that both you and Tobias, maybe you also, Tucker, said last night that you said particularly your closing argument was, well, there's so many pieces. You can't do them all at once with one single solution. So that's the other thing that when you say, what is the plan, people who haven't been as immersed in all this as people in the room now maybe think there's a single magic bullet drug solution, something or other, and it's more complicated than that. So getting the data together, each of these pieces has been important. I just want them to see that in addition to the document, because I think the document doesn't carry the weight that the work is entitled to be shown.
Just arriving back. Rima, did you have any comments? Did you already share? No. Okay. You know, I look at the document itself as it's already a historic document, right? We've gained great momentum since the process. I think that it was a good jump-off point to get us where we are today. To your point, I think it's important to convey all the other steps that are happening, and adding the implementation to the presentation or the discussion would have great value.
Yeah, and that, I mean, you might as well have written the email that I sent to Judy, like that, you know, people are going to have some level of appreciation for the process and the great benefit that came out of that, but they're really going to be interested in what comes next and kind of results. So we've given that message
there's
to
things we
Judy
didn't
for
even
the
know about, like the
presentation.
citizen article for $20 million at the time that we went through it. So again, it's a
And-
historic document, and there's things in front of us that,
And this,
right, so.
So just a final question. So is she only presenting, or are you all presenting also?
So Judy is going to I think we can craft the way that it happens, but I think the idea might be to give her an introduction, for her to go through, and we've said, let's keep it to like 10 minutes max, but then questions could go for as long as they go. But I think it would be, the anticipation is that, a representative or two of the trust would be there. I would be there. Judy would be there. And I think it's important for what you were just talking about, Judith, for the trust to be talking about these next things that are happening.
Well, I would just have to say yes, because it's too easy to get a consultant to do a report. We've had a fair number of reports that are mostly driven by consultants, and that if it's only the consultant, then you kind of give away the impression that there's any staying power.
Yeah.
And all of you and Tobias's work, and the number of times the board has really been engaged around these issues, the fact that it's in your strategic plan, I think we're missing the bet if we don't have kind of the continuing
Representation
story
and
that
discussion,
it's
yeah.
like, here's a plan, but it has legs, and here's the people that are carrying it on to the next stage. Because all the discussion about, do they have confidence, do people know what the point of this group is, and everything else, it's really it's important. Plus, it's the select board, it's the month before town meeting, it's the month before elections. So I think to really have it not just be, here's a talented out-of-towner who wrote a report, it's got to show the homegrown reality being carried forward too. And we've got such great representatives that really would be a lost opportunity if you did kind of split the time somehow.
So I guess my question is this, so we'll definitely look to Rita as our liaison of the Board of Selectmen to have some representation for us. Would other members of the board, and I plan on attending, would other members of the board should we post a meeting?
I think it'd be a good idea.
Yes.
I don't know if we all can come, but Charity's been going to many meetings because she's a candidate, and
Yep.
so it'd be really possible that you'd have a quorum there if you didn't post it. So better.
So, yeah, why don't we plan to post the meeting in the sense that, in the instance that we have more than a quorum and we can discuss it, and then we can plan, I can plan comments with Tucker and Judy as the chair. If anybody has anything specific they would like me to represent, I'm happy to, but if we post it, then everyone can be there to make their own commentary as well.
One thing, if I'm in order still, that would occur to me would be a one-page handout of this is what we've done this year. I mean, just as even if you didn't do the full spreadsheet, but something that shows like 10 things that have been done this year, because when I first came on this board like a year plus ago, I think it wasn't clear how this entity connected to the rest of the community or the respect it deserved or whatever. But part of what I'm saying is bring some exhibits and some takeaways that because that's probably useful stuff to have in hand for town meeting too, but why not have it there and be able to leave it on a table so somebody could take it home?
And include it in public record,
Yeah.
right? It'll go into the packet, so
Yeah.
that's a great suggestion.
Do we want to hand off the presentation itself at one point, like, so in sort of in line with what Judith has been bringing up here, and this isn't, this is for discussion, but do we want Judy, to take us through the, call it, process part of the work, and then hand off on the actual next step talk of the formal presentation, not just take questions?
Right.
Yeah.
I would say, I think that implementation part is where should be part of the presentation, and it should be where one of us,
Yeah.
probably one of you, takes over from Judy. I think that would be really helpful. And then I can have some comments afterwards, then there'll be questions. But I do think that would be, I think that would be an excellent way to show that we've already taken this.
So, Tucker, to that note, I don't want to get lost in the implementation charter graph, and I think that leads back to Judy's point about kind of some bulleted items that we could pull from that. Because while that has a ton of information in it, it can be distracting a little bit.
Yeah.
So why don't we bullet that out and make those the talking points for the discussion?
Yep.
Would that I think there'd be some value to have that full implementation plan in the select board packet, because yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
So having that backup
Absolutely.
detail.
Yeah. I think that's worth somebody looking at, but
Yeah.
not the narrative
Yeah.
of the conversation.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the intention would be to provide, like, to Erica for the packet, the 10-slide presentation, if you will, and then the actual report itself. So both are.
And then the implementation, the charts that we've written out that has all the task list items.
Which we would pull from to bullet slides in the presentation.
Yeah.
Right. For the talking points
Yeah.
for the implementation.
It's kind of like that technical data background.
I think it's important in that what's not included in the kind of year in review discussion were some of the items that have gone on that weren't included. The Tobias's article, the participation there, the Nantucket Inn dive. There's a
Fire station.
the fire station process. Those aren't included in the implementation, but should be the talking points.
Yeah, and exactly. Like, we would have a 1/2 pager of here's what we've been up to, in effect.
Great.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to help with that. And I also would encourage my fellow board members who are present to maybe think about being willing to step up to the microphone and just say, make a brief comment about, I don't know, on the order of what you're excited about that we're doing, or what you saw value in this planning process. I mean, I think having each of us voice something briefly about where we've been and where we're going, so that people recognize that we're an active, engaged group. that is ready to take on whatever the voters give us.
Great. Any more commentary?
No.
Moving to item 9. I don't see a review letter in the packet. Did we not get around to getting a draft?
We do not have a letter yet.
So
We have a new use, possibly.
what's that?
Funding the $20 million.
I think regardless of where we look to allocate it, we should just put a letter out to the Board of Selectmen as soon as possible, stating that.
Yeah, you don't want to miss the chance that you're going to be there on next Wednesday, so you'd like to have that in the packet even to be, so they're aware that it's coming in case they want to ask a question about it or something, right? Or is that too soon to be possible?
I guess we can cover now the things we want in it, right, and then have it drafted. The question becomes of what of the percentage of the 6% local allocation of the short-term rental tax would we be making an ask for fund for use in housing? And the last meeting we discussed providing the Board of Selectmen a letter, stating that we're interested in some portion of it. I don't know that my understanding from the Board of Selectmen's discussions, which were lengthy and carried over 3 different meetings, there was a 4% conversation. We need to kind of find out what the true value of the income stream is going to be. Do we leave it at 6 for this year and make some adjustment in the future? So it may not be at the 6%. So I think that this board should very clearly state its interest in some portion of that funding in perpetuity. And once they kind of figure out what the value is, while we may choose to direct it towards maintaining one thing or another, the statement should be, in my mind, general enough that let's.
But you probably want, if you can, to have some justification of what it would go for, rather than, because we're already getting a commitment through the other funds, the other warrant articles, whatever. So is it a good idea to, say, use it to cover the Tobias project, whatever, the warrant article, or...
I think if the community is willing to, bond that article in itself, this becomes another tool in the toolbox that the funds could be unrestricted and directed in a different manner.
And also, if the article didn't pass, then we would still want a portion of those funds anyways. So I don't think, that it would hinge on the article.
Don't pick it to one thing. I think keep it. It should be for housing purposes. Article or one program.
No, again, I understand. Please help me with this, Rita, that the intent from the state was that the funding, the local portion of the funding would be used for either infrastructure upgrades or for housing as kind of the directive. Was there any kind of dedication of percentages? Or
I seem to remember 35%, and it was, both those were designated as amounts to be targeted, as I recall.
Yeah, I haven't reviewed it there recently, but there was the mention of a minimum of 35%. I can't quite remember if that was directly in relation to a stabilization fund.
I think the 6%, the local 6%.
Tobias, could you go to the microphone, please?
My understanding was that the 6%, the room occupancy tax is up for the board to spend on whatever it would like, but the stabilization fund mandates that 35% would have to either go to housing or water quality.
Yeah, so I think that as Tobias said as well, that when there's a stabilization fund, 35% minimum. So I think when it's open-ended, if we're not going down the route of a stabilization fund, then I think we would choose the amount. At this stage, to my knowledge, just what's been spoken about at the board level, there aren't any other entities sort of vying for that funding the way there was when we had it for hotels and things. So we had that going to Department of Culture and Tourism specifically. So at this stage, nobody else is sort of making claims to it. So I think it is ours. But that was part of the last meeting, wasn't it? Discussing not to take the route of a stabilization fund, but to get more clarity on how we would do it.
Well, I think we leave that conversation to the finance department on how they're going to allocate it, and we make a request for 3%. Then it would be my personal.
3%?
50% of the new revenue stream on short-term rental tax is what we're talking about.
I would say 3% of the
Whatever the
tax.
number.
That way, if the Board of Selectmen makes an adjustment to the percentage, the 3% would maintain. That way, if they reduced it to 4, it wouldn't be 50% of the 4, it would be 3% of the local room short-term rental tax. That would be my personal opinion.
Is that on, because as you know, the short-term tax is it's the same that applies to hotels. So are you intending the new revenue stream or across the board?
I leave that to the discussion of the board. My assumption or understanding is that the current 6% on the hotel occupancy is already dedicated and spent. So what we're really talking about is 6% on the short-term rental tax portion. So my personal opinion would be to make a request for 3% of that.
Of the new revenue stream.
Of the new revenue
I think it's just
stream.
important to clarify in the letter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that way, if that percentage were to change at any point, 3% would be going to affordable housing. And it's only an ask for half today, but depending on what future boards decide to do, it would stay consistent. That would be my personal opinion. Rita.
Just clarifying that when you say 3%, so you mean 50% of the new, 3% of.
I mean 3% of the room occupancy tax. So yes, 50% of what is
stream
collected for this year. But if the Board of Selectmen makes a change, I don't want it to be 50% of the change. I want it to be 3%
Of the new.
the new tax.
You want 3%, whether the total is 4, 5, or 6.
Mm-hmm.
You want to, which is a little hard to convey, but you're saying, I think that's fair because really, we look at what the data platform gave us, right? I mean, part of what's driving the need for affordable housing here is people are renting short term and it's displacing people. And that's really a crisis here. And it needs to be addressed and the public understands it. We don't like having the state override local decisions. We've got lots of tools. The definitions don't have to match like the SHI list. So when it says affordable housing, it could be above 80% AMI. And I mean, there's a great deal there to be done. So I think there's both the argument, number one, that this revenue is really related to displacement. So we need the lion's share of it to go to trying to address the displacement. I think that in addition, the argument that we've got more than the average community has in terms of cost of living and the needs that go beyond what the state structure is. So we have a particular need in terms of a volume of money that lets us address that range of need. And then we've got plans for what to do with it. So to me, that's a pretty compelling 3-point kind of argumentation. Does the state proportion, that comes back?
That doesn't change. That's non-negotiable.
But I mean, is that when the select board talks about this, are they going to be thinking that the portion that is designated for the state's take of this tax, that that will be the source of funding that we're asking for in terms of a share of this new tax? Mm-hmm. No, they won't. Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe it comes back proportionally to the community that supplied it.
So I just, we need to be careful because in asking for basically 3% of whatever the select board decides, it does hamstring them a little bit because if they were to choose to go to 4%, there would be a loss on the room tax portion, which is money that they're already build into the budget because it has to be equal across the board, right?
So if they reduce the room, if they the total percentage that they charge for short-term rental or room occupancy has to be the same figure.
Exactly.
Right, correct.
Correct.
So in other words, at 6%, we ask for 3%. It's not a problem, but if they go to 4%, they're losing 2% on the room tax. That would have to be made up by a portion of the short-term rental tax to meet the same revenue amount. And so there's some math in there that's,
So right now, effectively what Brian is saying, if I think the last projections, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, that Brian Turbot had done, more or less said they anticipate, and we won't know until it happens, that the new revenue at the 6% would be more or less comparable to the revenue that we take in now from the room occupancy tax on hotels and inns. So in effect, what Brian...
For round numbers, is about $3 million.
Exactly. Yes, precisely. So new revenue stream of $3 million. So we're effectively asking for a quarter of the total revenue stream as it exists now, is what it equates to.
So we're basically asking for 1.5 million, leaving another 1.5 million available for some other funding. If there was a reduction of the 2%, the delta of the 25% could be used to fund the room occupancy tax portion.
Shortfall, yeah.
The shortfall.
yeah, that was what I was trying to get at.
I have one question, one comment. One is, how do we word this in a way that is clear? Because I think it's very easy to misinterpret. The other thought I had goes back, I can't remember if it was Judith or Brian that said it, but I do think there tends to be an issue where we've asked for 5 million. CPC is working that out with Brian Turbot. Now we're looking for an additional potentially 1.5 million. People will say, well, what are you going to do with that? If you already have the 5 million you need to fund your strategic plan, what do you do with the 1.5 million? And I think we do just have to be aware that we do, it shouldn't be Tobias's article, and it shouldn't be as specific as these programs, but I think we do have to look at justifying asking for 5 million to implement our strategic plan and now asking for more.
So my only comment to that is that this is a consistent and ongoing revenue stream that would support this board and the housing effort on Nantucket. That is not a one-time vote item as the 5 million would be, or as even Tobias's article would be, but it would be a in perpetuity consistent revenue source that could be planned for 15 years down the road, that then you have the opportunity to bond against, whether it was for an existing program or something else, whereas a one-time funding event doesn't allow bonding. That would be my quick answer to that.
This may not make any sense, but I'm just wondering if we want to send this letter following town meeting and the election, where we're going to have much greater visibility on what is available to this group, so that we can craft the statement as persuasively as we can in light of things that have happened.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think that does actually.
I agree with that, absolutely.
Can you, Tucker, work on a draft of this letter?
Yeah,
with supplies?
absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love to be able to vote on the letter at the next meeting and just do any last-minute word crafting that we have to do at the meeting itself.
Does everyone feel comfortable with us teeing it up in our select board presentation?
I
That
think
we're going to make an ask?
I think we hold it off based on the.
I think there are so many variables at this stage that could bring up a lot of questions, in that we've already teed it up a little bit. Have spoken about it before when we at the select board meetings about the stabilization funds. I think that with the CPC funds needing to go those through, needing to have the vote on the short-term rental tax in the first place, and then Tobias's article, I think there's enough things up in the air that it would be better to wait until after town meeting. That's my feeling.
But I'll work on a draft that we can start to think about.
Great.
Yeah.
So we're going to leave the exact same item on the agenda for the April meeting.
Yeah,
To
and I'll
finalize the letter.
I'll use the number that you talked about as the placeholder. Right
If
now.
everybody's comfortable with that.
Go big or go home?
Great. Item 10, MHP review. So I think this falls to the conversation about inquiring with them about, can we bring them on as a consultant to help draft the programs that have been in discussion to bring to this board? And I don't know if the contact was made on that discussion or not.
Yeah, I mean, I had talked with Susan Connolly, beforehand, and they're, as Brooke talked about, like a wealth of information and resource, and so I think to go to them specifically on like a program that we want them to advise on, they're available.
Okay, so do they need a contract to get started? What did they need specifically to get underway on that program development?
Well, I think they needed some more definition around specifically what programs we might want their advice on.
So I think at the last meeting, we prioritize 5 items and we did them in an order to say these are the ones we wanted to work on?
I can't recall. It's funny.
We did review the list, indeed. I'm going to suggest maybe that we establish a subcommittee that could work on formulating a process for this, getting help with program development. I think it probably would be worthwhile having a subset of this group have a conference call with folks from MHP and Tucker and talk about what that engagement might even look like. So it could be more of an iterative conversation at one time, rather than us talking about it and then going to them and coming back.
Okay, great.
I feel on this one, it wouldn't hurt to hold it off a little. I feel like we're snowed kind of with everything that's going on now, and that to get through town meeting and to put our energy into presenting select board and that kind of thing, that it wouldn't hurt to do that, but do it like in May, if that's not too far away. It seems to me we need to know where the money's going to fall out, and to really regroup. It may make sense to have a subgroup, but I would appreciate kind of a review the bidding with the whole group here, and this group's membership may change in April, right? Because there's reappointments or June, okay. Well, then maybe it needs to be done before June, but it feels like among the other things going on here, this is one that if we took a little pause on it, it would be a bad idea, but that may be wrong.
I'm anxious to move forward, getting this program development done any way, shape, form possible. So I don't want to push too far out the road. I'd like to see a well-defined, covenant buy-down program in place. So, or down payment assistance, or whatever the 5 priorities that we had are, and to get us to that place, I think that we need an outside consultant as soon as possible.
So you're basically saying to evaluate which goes first and which are priorities, and among the choices, we need consulting not just on which to execute, but whether to execute what in what order. So
I'm less concerned with what in what order. I'd like someone to come in and provide us, all of the data on not having a staff. What does the program outline look like? What other communities are doing?
Okay.
What's the program that's going to get put in front of us that we can vote on,
Okay.
and then allocate funding chunks to. So
all right, I didn't understand. Thanks.
It's kind of a how to execute. And I think it's funny because when Tobias came up to present, now that he's spent several months looking at his one project, he's checking off all the things that we need to do. The selection process, the purchase process, all these things. And I think that's what a consultant would provide, is that focused attention on these projects, start to finish. How do we execute that we don't have the time and attention and focus to do in a timely way?
So I would love it if we could just get the first conversation with MHP and say, what do you need for a 5-program commitment from us? How many times does a subcommittee need to meet? What is the funding we're looking at, and what is the timeline that you need participation from this board on? So then at the next meeting, we can come back and say, okay, this is what they say it's going to take. Let's create a subcommittee who's willing to be on it. It's a 4-month commitment, and it's going to take this much, and let's chunk out this contract in a way. Because what I recognize is, as a volunteer group, we are not going to draft the programs ourselves without the assistance of someone until we have a full-time department on hand.
And I just think back to your thoughts there, Judith, that once we have that how to execute for 5 different programs, then we will be able to prioritize based on the costs and the resources needed, benefits. Yeah. That's how I would imagine it.
Yeah, and I think we've outlined in the implementation what the different programs we want to look towards are, and if we can provide them that information, that would be great.
So I have one specific example of the complexities of program development in that I came to understand is a down payment assistance program, the way it's structured, can change the loan to value ratio and mess up with someone's mortgage ability to get a mortgage. And so those are the kind of things that I can't even imagine what the roadblocks might be or what the complexities are. And so I think saying to someone like MHP, these are the broad strokes of the programs we want to know, whether we can implement them here, whether practically implement them, and what are the legal challenges, what are the market challenges, what are the financing challenges, and then we can figure out even what's possible, much less what we should prioritize.
So, Tucker, is that first call a conversation that you're prepared to have, or do you need one of us to step in?
I can talk to them, and happy to have any member participate in the call. I mean, there are so many hours in the day, and we've looked at like a number of different opportunities that require an intense amount of time in a short time frame in recent months. So
and we have town meeting in 2 weeks,
we have a little bit going on, and I think that it's that there's going to need to be a lot of interactive information. MHP can say, here are 6 different towns that have down payment assistance programs. Take a look at them, and we can advise you on them and so forth. And they probably all provide down payment assistance of like 20 grand. Like, we're in a totally different ballpark. So they're going to, say, well, what are you really talking about in your market in terms of what you're thinking of providing?
Well, I think that conversation falls to Judy's point about where is the funding and what do they look like and how do we allocate the buckets. But and we can move the levers on the money without too much of a problem. But it's more about let's define what the programs look like, who can apply, what they qualifies, and bring those to the table, because it's all of those points and questions that we get stuck on and we get in the weeds and we don't get something created. So if somebody can bring it to the table.
But I think it's important to know going into it, like, we're committed to allocating $3 million or whatever toward that type of program. And so I do appreciate like Judith's thought process on it in terms of, like, there are a number of different moving parts at the moment. And, should the $20 million article pass at town meeting, there's going to be probably a lot of activity that needs to happen to set up like how that is all going to work before the first house is ever even thought of being bought. So, anyway, the short answer to your question is more than happy to follow up again with MHP. I think we need to start at least begin thinking about what are the types of the order of magnitude of funding that we might be considering to the 5 priorities, allocating should certain things happen at town meeting. So if it's going to take $400,000 or $500,000 to buy down a unit, like, are we prepared to allocate? We're going to allocate $1 million and try that. Like,
so my concern is that you're headed down a path that we're talking cart before the horse, and I really want to focus over the last few years. We talk about what are the programs, and let's pick the 5 programs, get them built, and then we can fund them. However, this may be a conversation for next year's funding cycle or application to the CHIP program or whatever it is. But without the program in place and allocating the funding, we really need to move this ball forward. And I recognize we need some outside source to help us get there until we have a fully staffed department. Go ahead.
It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg conversation because you don't know if it's worth doing until you know whether it's logistically possible, and you don't know whether it's worth spending a certain amount of money on until you know that, and you don't really know if it's there's a little bit of a circular logic. I think if I'm hearing Brian correctly, we're talking about what are the logistics and the actual processes of each program, and then we can evaluate the cost financially based on our market. But how do you go about doing buy downs?
Right.
Literally, what are the legal processes? And then we can figure out the financial piece of it. So,
within
does that make
Tobias's
sense?
article, there's conversation about covenant, buying covenant restrictions. Well, what does that program look like is my point, and how are we going to create it and define it? We know we need an outside source. Let's figure out what the contract looks like, engage them, and set them to task to create it. And then we can plug in the...
That's a part of Tobias's program, if you will. It's fine. I'm looking at the budget that we went to the select board with, and unless I am missing it, I don't see down payment assistance in the plan for the $3 million. That the major thing that we have in there is land acquisition. So if we're going to get $2 million extra, are we planning that that's going to go toward down? I'm not saying it's not worth looking at. All I'm trying to point out is that we have a lot of different things, and to just turn up a program that is going to take a lot of time to evaluate.
I'm trying to be realistic that this is a process that we're probably looking at 6 to 8 months by the time we have a handful of programs in place. This has been a conversation while I've been on this board about a down systems payment program, and I think I'm coming on either 4 years or 5 years, and still one doesn't exist. So I'm not claiming that this is money going to be spent within this fiscal year even. What we're looking at is how do we get something in front of us that we're looking at a program that we can vote on the particulars of an actual program. And that's I'd like to see these done in 12 months from now, so I want to take step 1 today.
And it might be phased out over 5 years, but I think that it really, even with the land acquisition, we haven't fully figured out how we're doing that. So we wrote out, I think 6 of the 9 things that we had were specific to land acquisition, down payment assistance, things like that. So to me, this is just a matter of looking at those things, having someone say, these are all the things that you need to do to execute. We say, these are the resources we need. Let's focus on land acquisition, which we've already decided. What's that program look like? Down payments, what's that program look like? And then these are 2, now that we know how they run, in future years, we'll phase them in over the next couple of years, because we have been batting them around.
Or, if we're buying restrictions, what qualifies under restrictions? What's the legal entity that the restriction looks like? How does somebody to apply to it? So here's the program, so you can qualify to apply, right? These are the steps that I want to. Yes, Jude.
I wondered, I don't know how they're staffed at MHP, but say we have 5 ideas that we want to flesh out. If you were to talk to them, would they tell you, here's the name of 5 different people, one that matches each of these? It would seem to me, I feel like sort of trying to drink water from a hose, that it might make sense to kind of schedule, April, May, whatever, and have identified people that could be on the phone for half it, like we did with Philly. And just kind of stage that out to be, because I hear part of what we're saying is we need to get educated to understand with the complexity in order to even wrap our heads around this, and that we don't want to just keep churning without having some advancement in that regard. But I don't think we can do or expect them to necessarily kind of do a full-blown workup on each of 5 things and have it all done in 6 weeks from now and deliver it. I think it's more, I found that discussion with Philippe to be very helpful. And if there were a way to do that kind of sequentially, it personally, I think down payment assistance is probably my least favorite among these, because I think it's a lot of money. It benefits fewer people. It's not kind of a systemic solution. But if that's been pending a long time and people want to say up or down on it, then maybe that's one that you start with. On the other hand, it may be one of the others. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't claim to have any priority on any of them, and I think we had a discussion that there were 5 we've been talking about. So and we may deliver them all, and they might say that this is the most cost effective. So start with this and then work your way backwards. I don't know the answers.
I think that the type of thing that Judith was just describing makes a lot of sense to me. Is that I think it would be very easy to go to MHP and say, here are the 5 programs that we're considering, as part of the tools we may want to make available in our toolbox, and we want to line up a discussion with a subject matter expert in each of these areas. Like, who would you recommend, either in-house or outside, and schedule 1 or 2 calls per upcoming meeting to get a more full understanding of not only how the program may work in these different instances, but the types of things they're going to require, like from us, to if we really were to want to move further forward with each of these. It may help in our prioritization of things.
I think that's great. Let's get that moving.
And I'm going to suggest that we work on it in April, given the time commitments and everything that needs to be done between now and town meeting.
I mean, I can reach out to them easily now to say, this is what we're
This is
looking
coming.
for. Can we schedule something?
Yeah.
That's not too time consuming to do.
I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Let's get on let's have that call so we can get on the calendar. So we're not having that call after the April 15th meeting,
Yeah.
which then we're on the calendar in May.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we can.
Well, I'd also say it's such a virtue to be in this room and to be recorded, because that means if we have an interaction with them in future, if we want to get more public input, we might have a half-hour clip that people could look at and
Yeah.
refer back to. So it's also a way to kind of stimulate further conversation. We're coming into the summer, so there will be different people around. We've talked about expanding our
resources.
range of advisors or whatever. So
Yeah.
it may well be that there'll be people that they identify that would dovetail with people you already know will be here in the summer, for all I know. But
Yeah. No, I think it's a great suggestion.
Great.
I have to run.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I do as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Should we move the other agenda items forward? I mean, I think that these are all really part of this implementation process anyway.
Yeah. I don't, is there anything on the remaining portions of the agenda that anyone feels the need that we need to get through today?
Not for me,
But
no.
Okay.
except for adjournment.
Yeah, so hearing none, let's move the remaining portions of the agenda from 11 on to the next meeting. And can I have a motion on item 17?
Move to adjourn.
In a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, guys.